we recognize the extensiveness of the creative act of the Son in Colossians 1. Why? What's the background issue? Well, it's a form of angel worship and proto-Gnosticism. And so, in talking about Christ, let's go back to you have Paul's prayer, the church of Colossae, strength of all power, according to his glorious might, attaining of all steadfastness, patience, giving thanks to the Father, who has qualified us. This is addressed to Christians, who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. So as with all the others, you have the emphasis upon the divine initiative, divine accomplishment. We are giving thanks to the Father. He has qualified us. We didn't qualify ourselves. He qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. How did he do that? How were we qualified to share in this cosmic inheritance? For he rescued us from the domain of darkness. He did that. And transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Now, as we've seen in Romans 8, so we see here, all of these things elsewhere when talking about the nature of the gospel, avoiding Judaism, everything else, what does Paul emphasize? This is by faith, not by works of law. But as he does in Romans 8, here in Colossians chapter 1, God does all these things. How do we have redemption? Well, faith, but it's not mentioned here because it's a divine act. And faith, the gift of faith given to the elect of God, will have that faith that pleases the Father. This is the mechanism that we see, that we experience, but none of that changes the overarching reality that we're giving thanks to the Father because he's done all these things. This is God's work. He's the one that rescued us from the domain of darkness. We didn't flick our bick and find our way out autonomously, the bick of faith. Oh, I found my way. No. He rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. That's a divine act. That's the same divine power that is in reference in John chapter 6 when Jesus recognizes the Father has the right to give a certain people to the Son. And as a result, they will follow him. They will come to him. God-centeredness versus man-centeredness. It's can't escape it. Transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. In him. So the centrality of Christ. Here we are in the kingdom of his beloved Son. That's the kingdom of light. That's where the saints are. It's all of God. Now that's certainly a highly exalted view of who Jesus is. So, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, the one having preeminence over all of creation. For by him all things created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, the thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, all things being through him and for him. Yes, there's clearly an anti-proto-Gnostic polemic here. Because there seems to be people who are being taught in Colossae, or being tempted by teachers in Colossae to get into this sort of this mixture of Jewish and proto-Gnostic, early Gnostic ideas of the worship of angels, and he uses the pleroma and eons and things that will eventually become very complicated in the fully developed Gnostic myth that we've talked about many times before. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So here is the Creator himself. So that's why he is the one, kingdom of light, his kingdom. But he is also the head of the body. So now you have a another aspect of the context. This didn't come up in the hour and 45 minutes I listened to. This didn't come up because this is a transitionary statement. He is also head of the body, the church. Now, does the church exist in the created realm? Of course. But is the church a separate category than all created things, whether in heaven and earth, visible, invisible, principalities, powers, principles? Yes. The church is the work of Christ by grace through his Spirit. So we've made a shift. This is the introduction of something new. He is the arche. Now, that arche is then connected with prototokos, ekton, nekron. And I think if Sam wasn't so intent on going the direction he's going, maybe in looking at this, this might have caused him to stop and go, well, wait a minute. Prototokos here has a different range of meaning than prototokos just a few verses before. Prototokos in verse 15, prototokos passes ktisos, of all creation, does not have the same meaning as prototokos ekton nekron, does it? Nope, different meaning, different range. So he is the firstborn from the dead. And so there's the protos element of prototokos, which is protos and tikto, in creation has to do with origin and source. Because the resurrection takes place in time, there's more of a temporal aspect than there would be any other. So we have shifted into now a redemptive context, because the church only comes into existence in that context, right? I mean, these are just, there was more than once that Sam was pressing Matt and saying, context, you got text, not traditions of men. Okay, I'm just being in the text. Being in the text. And if you're going to be in the text, a transition has taken place. And it is, beginning of verse 18, he is the head of the body, the church, who is also the arche, the prototokos ekton nekron, in order that he might come to have preeminence, first place, protuon, primacy in all things. Now, I won't get down with this today. Probably should have realized that when you listen to something for that long while writing and think about it, you're going to end up having too much to say. Primacy in all things should cause someone to stop and go, I've heard something vaguely familiar to that somewhere else. Yeah. Before we get to 120, let's see what the connection here is. The book of Ephesians. I told you it's a parallel text. Is there anything in Ephesians that might shed some light on this? Yeah. Ephesians 1:8, in all wisdom and insight he made known to us the mystery of his will according to his kind intention, which he purposed in him, that is in Jesus, with a view to an administration suitable to the fullness of times, that is, the summing up of all things in Christ. You want the Ephesian letter interpretation of first thing in all things, the summing up of all things in Christ. Why? Because what's the next line in Ephesians 1:10? Things in heaven and things on the earth. What you really should do if you want to dig into these texts is, and most Bible programs can do this now, put Ephesians and Colossians in parallel columns, just like we do when we do synoptic studies. Put Matthew, Mark, and Luke in parallel columns, throw John in when he decides to join the party, which is fairly rare, but put them in parallel columns. And it's like shining a light, because you go, oh, okay, here's this part here. Because remember, these are sent out at the same time. The same thought patterns are running through the apostle's mind as he's writing these things. But he's using different words to express them. Oh, that's helpful. Yeah. With a view to administration suitable to the fullness of the times, that is, the summing up of all things in Christ, things in heaven and things on the earth. In him also we have obtained an inheritance. Oh, inheritance of the saints in light, Colossians 1, Ephesians 1. Also we have obtained an inheritance, what? Having been predestined according to his purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will. The same apostle who talks about inheritances and summing up all things in Christ roots it and grounds it in the one reality that I fear Sam Shamoun doesn't believe in anymore. According to his purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will. Everything that started in Ephesians chapter 1 has been about the elect of God, chosen by the Father, by his will, his purpose, his intention. And that's what was missing in the whole debate. That's what was missing in the whole debate. That was the presupposition that was being debated without being mentioned. Because, like I said, I'm not going to even try to defend particular redemption apart from the full-orbed revelation of, well, why did Christ die? Who was Christ? What did the Father and the Son intend to do in his death? These are central. This is what makes the doctrine of particular redemption. And so, there you have a parallel passage. So when we go back to Colossians chapter 1, you have this idea right there. It was the Father's good pleasure expressed in what? Who's the Father? The one who works all things after the counsel of his will. The one who is summing up all things in Christ. So it's the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him. Now, obviously, that could be specifically in Colossians a anti-Gnostic polemic, because he is utilizing one of the key Gnostic buzzwords, pleroma. That could be why it's there, and the emphasis is Jesus can't just be one of the eons. He can't be an emanation, because it's the Father's good pleasure for all the pleroma, which was all those eons. That pleroma thing, same term is used here. That's why people see an interplay taking place. So maybe there's some of that there, but the point is, it's the Father's good pleasure that all the pleroma dwell in him in Colossians 1:19. So, have we seen, are we agreed now in verses 18 and 19 that we have moved away from merely viewing creation as tapanta, and we're now talking about what the Father and the Son do in time in the formation of the ecclesia? So now there is redemptive aspects that have been introduced that you have to now explain, and I never heard Sam do this, why you would backwards read 120 into 16 and 17 without dealing with the differentiation that has taken place in 18 and 19. We ain't done, because we still haven't gotten to verse 20, and we still need to get all the way to Colossians 2:14, because that became one of the central aspects that kept feeding back. Matt was on 2:14, and Sam would keep trying to drag him back and say, it can't mean that because of this back here. So we haven't even gotten there. But you might say, why don't you just keep going? Well, there are a number of you going, just stop already.